Oh, and there.
We'll have one of us. That's true.
Welcome. Good to be here. I'm Steve Robinson. I think I know most of you. I'm the Director of Education Services for the Discourse product in ETS, working through currently product development. You never know, things could change. So I'm happy you could come this morning, and I'm going to get right to it very quickly. I want to give just a little bit of background. I'm going to very soon introduce Dr. Stanley Deno, standing right here, from the University of Minnesota, College of Education, Special Education Program, and Dr. Douglas Marston, who works in Minneapolis Public Schools, urban school district. There's two school districts in Twin Cities. One is Minneapolis, one St. Paul. They never talk to each other, they never meet, they never work together. I'm from St. Paul, I know nothing about Minneapolis, so this is going to be as interesting to me as it will be to you. Doug and Stan are friends and colleagues of mine, and a little bit of context is important to their presentation because we all came together, as it were, at the University of Minnesota back in the late 70s. And Stan's work in the area of curriculum-based measurement was the starting point for that. There was an Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities, which is one of 5 major institutes nationwide. They conducted research on learning disabilities, and the main focus was on assessment. And Doug and Stan was a co-director of that institute, and I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota at that time in special education, and Doug was in the school psychology program. And those of you who are familiar with this approach will recognize some of the other names, and Stan will talk about some of the people that were involved in his presentation. Now, the context of that is that we started within the area of curriculum-based measurement, and through Stan's guidance helped develop it to the status that it is now, and it continues to grow rapidly, as you'll see. But also, I lived and worked in Minnesota, and we all three live there. It's nice to be here where it's a bit warmer. We all live in the Ice Palace. You've probably seen that on television. But I became associated, familiar with discourse back in 1983 is when I first saw it, and I was a research and evaluation person who did the early research work on discourse, and Stan and Doug were both colleagues of mine as links into the schools and into the University of Minnesota to consult on much of that research. So they're familiar with discourse as well. And early in that process, we began to explore this idea of merging the technology advantages of discourse with the assessment advantages of curriculum-based measurement. Just wanted to give that preface to let you know that they are aware of our work in this area and the interest of ETS in potentially exploring this area of curriculum-based measurement and putting technology, using technology's advantages to do some scalable enterprise in that area. So I would like to introduce Stan Deno, and he will do the first presentation. And I'd like to follow the format that we have for all of these seminars. If you would hold your questions until Stan is done, there'll be a period for you to address issues that he's brought up, ask your questions, and then Doug will do a presentation, and then we'll have an ample time to address issues and questions after they're both completed. Okay, any questions now? Arnie?
Can we get copies of the PowerPoints? Because my note-taking behavior differs if I know that coming.
Is that all right with you folks?
Sure. What kind of a budget does ETS have?
It's hundreds of pages. Thanks.
I think I was here. I lost track of when that was, a year ago. I don't think it was that long.
Spring?
No, last spring, thanks. And I did provide you with a copy of my PowerPoint presentation at that time. Although I did have him sign away his firstborn or something. You know, Steve hasn't been in Minnesota for the week and didn't realize I've gotten so hot and sunny there. You're probably wondering why I had this sort of red flushed look in my face. I was out working on this presentation behind the curtain hall and fell asleep and got this tremendous sunburn. That's why my face is as red as it is. Actually, some of you probably have guessed that I'm going through a treatment for precancerous lesions on the face. And I have to put this ointment on every day. And it just, you know, it gets inflamed looking. And I didn't expect it to be quite so thrilling as it is when I came out here.
Someone said you should be more inflammatory.
Steve said that I'm in special education at the University of Minnesota, and that's true, but I'm in the broader Department of Educational Psychology, and so lots of my colleagues, and my degree is actually originally in educational psychology in the area of learning and would now be learning and cognition. And a lot of my colleagues are the people in educational and psychological measurement. And how many of you know the name Jack Merwin? Does anybody know that name in here? Jack was involved in developing the Stanford Achievement Test many years ago, and he was my measurement instructor when I was a graduate student there. Doug and I have split this presentation up today so that I'm doing kind of background conceptual stuff on curriculum-based measurement, and Doug is going to share with you the applications of curriculum-based measurement in the Minneapolis Public Schools, which has been going on for some 20 years approximately now. Those of you who were here last spring, how many of you saw my presentation last spring? Oh, I better get a different. There will be overlap, certainly, but I think there's some different things about this one too, I'm hoping anyway. My goal, as it says here, is to focus on the progress measures and general outcome measurement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but the term curriculum-based measurement and general outcome measurement go together. One is the more general case, and one is the more specific case. Formative evaluation is the system that we were working on developing in the Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities at the University of Minnesota. I actually got started on this in the early 1970s. I got to the University of Minnesota in the fall of '69, and about 3 years into that appointment, I was responsible for doing some teacher education, teacher training, and particularly concerned about having students do field actual instruction and my evaluating their effectiveness as teachers back at that time. And what I encountered early on was that, and it has been true ever since then, and you probably all know this very well, that there are almost as many different ideas about how to teach a child something as there are people who are trying to teach a child something. That is, everybody has a different idea, and a lot of it depends on who they got their training with, and a lot of it depends also on their personal experience. And when those things combine, then you get different people wanting to teach the same child in different ways. And I was supervising their work, and I thought, well, how do I address this? Do I just try to impose my own perspective on how it is that people ought to teach? And so I backed off and said, well, how about trying to be a little bit more empirical and scientific about this? And so I thought, why can't we develop a simple evaluation system that the teachers can use, that I can use with them to determine the effectiveness of what it is that they're doing? And that's that formative evaluation system that I'm going to be talking more about today. So the original idea was to create a simple set of procedures that teachers could use to systematically evaluate the effectiveness of their efforts to teach students with disabilities. And the image that I was operating off of was the single case research design image. And that if we could do repeated measurements on student performance across time and establish consistencies in that performance, then introduce interventions at those vertical lines at various points and see whether there was a shift in the data, that at some simple level the teachers would be doing systematic evaluation of the extent to which what they were doing was really having an impact on the growth of student performance. To do something like this, of course, requires that you what I did is I went to the teachers right away and I said, okay, if you're going to teach a child to read, how do you measure or how do you evaluate whether or not the child is learning to read? Well, the idea that you should be able to collect data routinely on kids' performance and evaluate what you were doing was completely foreign to almost all the teachers at that time. And now with all of the pressures for testing and assessment, so forth, teachers have a better sense that they're supposed to be involved in doing the evaluations and assessments, but even now, I don't think most teachers have gotten into teaching because they want to systematically evaluate academic growth. I don't think that's it. Most of the teachers don't come in with the kind of engineering orientation. They come in with a more humanistic orientation, wanting to work with kids and help kids and so on. So I asked them, what do you measure or what do you look at when you try to teach reading? Nobody could answer the question for me. Fortunately, I had a woman that I was working with who was a remedial reading person named Deno, and she said, well, Stan, you know, mostly what we work on is word recognition and comprehension in reading. Aha, all right, there are a couple of constructs or a couple of ideas here we could go after. And so back in the early 1970s, we started to develop this system for repeated measurements of student performance, focusing in the area of reading on word recognition and comprehension. The idea was that what's being illustrated here is after some baseline condition, which you might consider to be the regular classroom, then teachers implementing a change, as in this situation right here, who are special education teachers, without using any kind of systematic formative evaluation, might get some improvement, but not very much. And if they would then do the second one over here, using some formative evaluation system, that they would be able to produce a steeper rate of increase in student achievement. And it was a hypothesis at that time. We didn't really have a system, and we didn't know whether it was going to work. And so the idea was to systematically attack this and see if we could really build a system that would produce that kind of an outcome. When you read about this or hear about this, oftentimes you'll hear both about curriculum-based measurement and curriculum-based assessment. I think of curriculum-based assessment as a common noun. That is, it's a general term that people use that includes many approaches, typically involving something called mastery monitoring, where people break down a task into component parts and monitor growth on those component parts in the school curriculum. Curriculum-based measurement, in contrast, is a term that I coined in an article that I wrote that appeared in Exceptional Children in 1985. And what there I was referring to is the specific system that we had been working on developing at the University of Minnesota over about a 10-year period prior to the writing of that article. And the term curriculum-based is appropriately used when the stimulus materials are drawn directly from the curriculum of the school. As it turns out, the same system can be used without using specific stimulus materials from the curriculum of the school. And that's where we coined the term general outcome measurement in contrast to curriculum-based measurement. Now, our idea was that in developing this research program, that we would have a measurement system that could efficiently produce time series data. And we needed to establish not only what to measure, but how to measure growth. And so we wanted to, I'd been trained in kind of basic psychology of verbal learning research at that time. And I was not used to the idea of an empirical enterprise that had as a specific goal the design of a system. So this was all sort of new to me. My research prior to that had been more principle focused and not the design of a specific system that people could use. But I thought we could actually use empirical approach to create such a system. And we ultimately wanted to determine whether or not in in a systematic experimental study, teachers could actually use this system to produce better outcomes for students. At that time, as Steve said earlier on, I was really fortunate when we were funded over this 6-year period as Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities at about, well, I guess I shouldn't say, it's a lot of money anyway, over those 6 years. Some of you might have contacts in the federal government. Get me in trouble. But I was really fortunate to, as Steve said, it was like alignment of the stars or something, you know. These people happened to be in the graduate program, all of them except for Gary Gurman, happened to be in the graduate program at the University of Minnesota in educational psychology, and all of them worked with me on this project as research assistants. And in some cases, I will even own up to the fact that I was their doctoral advisor. In other cases, I wouldn't own up to the fact that I was the doctoral advisor. I'll let you decide for yourself about Doug Marston in that case, where he falls. Now, Lynn Fuchs is currently at Vanderbilt University, Doug and Lynn Fuchs, and some of you, many of you perhaps have read their work and know Lynn. Doug is here. Mark Shin was at the University of Oregon, and he's on leave from the University of Oregon this year, but was at the school psych program at Oregon and did more, I think, than anyone in this group to bring a curriculum-based measurement into the field of school psychology nationally. He's done lots and lots of training and is very well known in NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists. And this year, is it in March, we're doing this, the NASP is meeting in Dallas, and we're doing a special, April, and we're doing a special, yeah, you better check your calendar. We're doing a special session, curriculum-based measurement 20 years later or something like that, to sort of a reflection on where we were and where we are and where we're likely to be going. Karen Wesson went to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee and died from breast cancer about 10 years ago. Gary Gurman was the director of special education in the Pine County Public Schools, and that's where we did all of our original field testing. Gary has since retired and has now developed his own product called AimsWeb that is rooted in these same procedures, curriculum-based measurement procedures. Phyllis Merkin was the associate director of the Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities, and she died of lung cancer back in 1983. Steve Robinson is here, and Jerry Tyndall is still at the University of Oregon. I think he's chair of one of the departments in the College of Education at the University of Oregon. So this is a group that's been very, very productive. Recently, a graduate student were involved in a new grant and a new project, as I will mention later. And a graduate student did a preliminary lit search in the area of curriculum-based measurement and came up with about 303 citations, I think, now, that most of them come from all these people right here. When we started out with this program of research, I thought it was important for us to establish a certain set of what I have no better way of referring to this other than design requirements for this measurement system that we were trying to create. If you were going to do this, you had to take into account that it was teachers doing it in the classroom, it had to be efficient, it had to be practical, so that when we looked for ways to repeatedly measure student growth, we had to have some constraints or some limits on what we might create. And so these design requirements, Doug said the other day he could still remember the day I walked in with the transparency and put those up on a screen and said, okay guys, this is what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to build a measurement system that first of all, of course, produces reliable and valid data or indicators, and I have that bolded because I think of the data collected through this procedure as being indicative of broad proficiency or underlying construct. That would be sensitive to growth over very short ranges of time. And this is one of those things that
became important because people were complaining a lot about how typical standardized achievement tests, it took you about a year to see change in student performance. And if teachers were going to use this more routinely to try to evaluate the effectiveness of what they were doing, there would need to be sensitivity that would provide data showing change in level of performance across time within shorter ranges, you know, weeks really. And so that's the idea of sensitivity to growth. They'd have to be time efficient so that and the metaphor that I used all the time back then was like the vital signs of educational health, the vital signs, you know, of medical health, like temperature and blood pressure and things like that, that just take a few minutes to get this information, and it's important information, but it doesn't tell you everything when you're sick, but it gives you some important information. And I said this would have to be something like taking a child's temperature, so that it might take 2 or 3 minutes and you get some information that was really important. That it would have to be repeatable so that we could generate the time series data. It would have to be easy to administer. And especially it would have to be easy to teach and train people to do it reliably and consistently. Couldn't be like our school psych program trains the students in assessment, and it's, you know, it takes hours and hours of training to administer individual ability and achievement tests and to interpret and summarize that. And this just wasn't going to be practicable within an ordinary school setting. And it had to be easy, the data had to be easy to understand and easy to explain to other people. So potentially, not only classroom teachers, but parents could easily understand the data and make sense out of it. And those were the kind of criteria that we established for the design of this system. Now, when I was here before, I created for that presentation last spring this particular series of slides, and I want to go back to it because this distinction, I think, is really important. And it's a distinction that I make between two approaches to progress measurement. One of them, Lynn Fuchs and I called mastery monitoring. We wrote an article on this, paradigmatic distinctions between alternative approaches to progress monitoring. And one of these approaches I refer to as mastery monitoring is the more common approach, or the one that people think of when they think about assessing a student's progress in the curriculum across time. And the other one is this generic general outcome measurement approach, which is the CBM approach. Mastery monitoring I think of as tracking progress through specific skills or content domains using criterion reference testing. And it's typically based in some sort of content or task analysis that looks like this. Now, why these boxes, why these words are cut off in the box, I don't know. It's something about PCs, I guess. I use a Macintosh, and PCs don't allow you full expression. Macintosh. But at the very top in that box, it's supposed to be expressive writing. And the idea is that you take an outcome like expressive writing, and with mastery monitoring, what you have to do is break that down into component parts, do some sort of analysis. And those are usually done logically, and such subject matter experts try to apply their knowledge to doing such an analysis. And I created two streams there, one of them being kind of the mechanics stream, the formal stream, which is on this side over here. No, it's on that side over there, developing paragraph structure, using formal codes, capitalization, punctuation. And on this side, it's supposed to be the ideational content of what it is that the person is writing about or expressing, and how that gets broken down into sentences, complete ideas, expressing complete thoughts, using sense, identifying, blah, blah. So you get the idea. You know, when you have an outcome like that, and you're going to do some sort of assessment using a task analytic and criterion reference testing approach, you're going to break that outcome down. You're going to develop then, as item 2 indicates, point to test items or tasks for each of those components. And you measure on those components to see whether the student is learning how to punctuate a sentence properly, to have a beginning and end punctuation or something like that. And you work on that for a while, and when you think the student has mastered that or has got it, then you move on to something else, and you work on that for a while, and then you move on to something else. And when you do that, teach, test, teach, test, teach, test, then you have to lay out some sort of a sequence or scope and sequence of what the skills are and what the test procedures are going to be, and then you're going to work your way through that. And if you set it up to monitor progress using a mastery chart, then you'll have cumulative tasks mastered. So each, on the vertical axis, is each of the skills within that breakdown. And when those mastery of the first skill occurs on day 5, then you plot up 1 to indicate that the first skill has been learned, and then across the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days you might measure, and it isn't until day 10 that you measure the second skill, or 11, and then you jump up and plot that way, and it's a cumulative record then of tasks mastered. That was actually the first system that we set up at Seward Elementary School in Minneapolis, and we were using at that time the ABC series of basal curriculum, and we were set up a mastery monitoring system in that basal reading series to track a student's progress through the scope and sequence of that basal reading series. And we wrote a book, Phyllis Merkin and I did, called Database Program Modification, based primarily on that progress monitoring system that looked like this, and we laid out the chart across the year, and we had students tracking progress and showing us how successful they were in helping children learn using that mastery monitoring system. When we got to the Institute of Research for Research on Learning Disabilities, we started exploring this other alternative that I'm referring to here, and Lynn Fuchs and I refer to as general outcome measurement. General outcome measurement is a scaling of improvement in performance on a single task across time, or a general curriculum outcome. In this case, it requires that we are very careful about identifying what these core tasks or outcomes are that we're going to monitor on, because we're going to just stick with that and we're going to measure it across time. And we have to know what our procedures are for repeatedly measuring across time and charting performance. If we go back to the example of expressive writing, with a general outcome measurement approach, we would say, okay, our outcome is expressive writing, because that's what we're interested in teaching the child. So now what we're going to do is we're not going to measure on each of those component parts. What we're going to do is measure on the outcome, on expressive writing. We're going to go right to the outcome, and from the beginning, start measuring the student on the outcome. To do this, we spend a lot of time establishing what task we're going to use to scale increases in proficiency on that outcome, and that's what I keep referring to as what to measure. What are we going to measure? And then we have to establish these procedures that meet the design requirements for how to measure on that task, and what data, when we measure, are reflective of growth on that outcome of expressive writing. And when we finish, our progress graph looks more like this, because we repeatedly measure, and in some days the scores might go up, but some days the scores might go down. So it's not unlike, I would say, getting on a bathroom scale, and some days it goes up, probably more days it goes up, and then some days it comes down, right? So we don't always make systematic, consistent growth in one direction. In this case, I'm not going to talk about this much, but we, over time, have established that a number of correct word sequences, or as the child gets older, a number of correct minus incorrect word sequences in writing from a story starter, in writing a paragraph from a story starter, works as a good indicator of that general outcome of written expression proficiency, and it's the one that we've used and are continuing to use in the area of written expression. So the basic approach that general outcome measurement is rooted in is repeated measurement of performance on the same task across time. And out of our own experience, analogously, I think you might consider, for example, how, if anybody, a runner, it keeps track, anybody in here a runner and keeps track of how long it takes them to run a specific distance? Or at least you know somebody? You've heard about that? In any athletic endeavor, almost, if you do sit-ups or pull-ups or push-ups or anything like that, and you measure your performance on that same task across time, now the idea is to reflect change in that thing that you're interested in, that outcome that you're interested in. In my case, a score in playing the University of Minnesota golf course is important. That's my standard task. And I got to say, sometimes it goes up and sometimes it comes down. And for a while it was going up more than it was going down, but recently it's been going down again. And so that's my standard task, and it's a reflection of a whole bunch of things about my golf game. You know, it's an indicator. My score is an indicator of a whole bunch of things about my golf game. Not just a single thing, but a whole bunch of things. And that's how I think about these indicators that we've worked on in curriculum-based measurement. I don't know exactly how piano teachers get at fluency in playing a particular piano piece, but I can remember taking piano lessons as a kid and never got very fluent on my recital piece, you know, but it's still the only thing I can play at all on the piano. It's Knight Rupert, as I recall, is the title of that. I don't know if any of you ever learned Knight Rupert. But similarly, when you have a skill like a performance, like playing the piano, you might have some way of assessing fluency in performance. Or I was thinking about flying out here. I was in the Air Force for 3 years, and I know that I wasn't a pilot, but I know that pilots are trained to do pre-flight aircraft checks where they sit down in the cockpit, and they have a whole routine that they have to go through. And I thank goodness, and I hope that routine is one that involves at least changes in accuracy across time on those pre-flight checks before they're allowed to take an aircraft up by themselves. Now, there are some really important contrasts between the mastery monitoring approach and the general outcome measurement approach. In the mastery monitoring approach, I think the single most important thing is, at the outset, what the breakdown of the task is. What are the component parts? What is it that you would take, if you took reading or took writing, what would be all the subcomponents in those areas that you would then set up your measures around for purposes of monitoring growth? In contrast, in general outcome measurement, for me, the critical thing has always been, what is the task that we measure on? What is the outcome in reading? When I go into the teachers and I ask the teachers, what do we look at in reading, and they couldn't tell me exactly what they looked at to establish whether a child was getting better in reading it, that left me with the problem of trying to figure out, well, then what should we be looking at in the area of reading across time that we could use to systematically evaluate growth in reading? And in the Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities, I'll show you the basic procedure we use to identify the outcome. The nice thing about the mastery monitoring approach for lots of people is that it provides a certain degree of diagnostic prescriptive information. So if you break a task down and start measuring on the components, then you can talk to people about whether the student has learned that particular component and whether you might teach that component. The downside of that, I found out in my early work, was that it almost immediately put me into conflict with different people who consider themselves experts in that curriculum field. Because different people in the area of math or reading have very different ideas about what the important components are of reading, in reading. And we break down reading, and some don't think you ought to break it down very much, you know, are more holistic in their approach. And so the one thing that led me to decide that we would move more toward the general outcome measurement approach was that it freed us up from commitment to any particular curriculum scope and sequence. So that if we developed an assessment system and came in with it and people said, well, what's your curriculum? And they didn't buy into that curriculum scope and sequence, then they wouldn't buy into assessing progress in that scope and sequence because they weren't teaching that in that way. So on the one hand, it's useful to get diagnostic prescriptive information, so long as people think that those components in that sequence are the right ones. But if they don't, you can really get into conflict over this, and nowhere is that more true, I think, than, well, in basic skills, for sure. The general outcome measurement approach is designed to create a formative evaluation system, and so it's not diagnostic prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what to teach, it tells you whether what you are doing is effective. Not what should you teach, but is it effective. So it's, again, it's like your child has a fever, or you have a fever, and at the very least, what you can learn by taking someone's temperature is whether or not the procedures intended to bring down the fever are working. Or if you get on the bathroom scale and you're trying to lose weight, at the very least, it's telling you whether your procedures for losing weight are working. That's how the general outcome measurement functions. It doesn't tell you what to teach, it tells you whether or not what you've been teaching is working, or how you've been teaching and what you've been teaching is working. There's more of a short-term focus as opposed to a long-term focus. My dream is actually in the area of reading to have something perfectly analogous to the bathroom scale, where a child gets on it in grade 1, and you use the same scale over and over and over and over and over again until grade 8 or grade 10. I think it's too bad if you have to shift, either change the scale from one year to the next, if I have to use different materials on your grade 2 from grade 3 to grade 4, because I've changed the instrument somehow by doing that. The meaning or interpretation in mastery monitoring is derived from, I think, the idea that the student is mastering and therefore making progress toward the goal. One of the other things that I always worried about is the possibility that the child could actually make progress on the sub-skills but wouldn't be improving so much on the outcome. I really worry about that a lot. And so this approach gets you away from that, because if the student's not improving on the outcome, then you better change what you're doing, because the outcome is where it's at. That's what you're about. It's not the sub-skill, it's the outcome. I'll talk about those multiple references or interpretations later on. And finally, I think the technical adequacy of most mastery monitoring systems has never really been established very much. People do a lot of classroom-based assessment. People create these sort of criterion reference sequencing, end-of-unit tests, and so forth. But most of the time, we don't really know much at all about the reliability and validity of those tests. There hasn't been a lot of systematic effort behind that. A curriculum developer once told us at an AERA convention that they weren't going to spend a lot of time working on providing us with data on either the effectiveness of the curriculum or the reliability and validity of the tests until the consumers demanded that they did that. And since the consumers weren't demanding it, that is, the public schools weren't demanding data on the effectiveness of the curriculum or the reliability and validity of the tests, it was not cost effective for them to spend time working at that. Now with evidence-based programs, maybe that'll change. So curriculum-based measurement, repeatedly measuring growth. Growth is key, growth. So we really look at slope of student proficiency in core constructs that underlie success in the curriculum. At core constructs. We're not measuring everything that gets taught, but just trying to find those key things that we could measure on across time that would be reflective of growth or improvement. I showed this last spring when I was here. Minnesota, like so many states, is going through what we were going through a major shift in what the state standards are going to be. We got a new commissioner of education. Actually, we had something called Profiles of Learning that Minnesota had created, working on these big performance packages, lots of qualitative stuff. Now we get this new commissioner in. We got a new Republican governor. We got a Republican commissioner of education now who was in Virginia and helped work on the state standards in Virginia. and was recommended, I think, by the current White House administration to us as our commissioner, state commissioner of education. And she has brought in, it's like night and day, because this profiles of learning is this qualitative packages, performance packages, huge things that can, building birdhouses and things like that as ways of determining outcomes, writing small novels and things. Now it's back to the multiple choice test. We specify content and develop our multiple choice test. And I've been living long enough in academia and working on stuff like this to be able to sort of go with the flow. For me, performance packages didn't work very well, and for me, the kind of stuff that our current commissioner is pressing probably isn't going to be what I put my kids through. But that's politics, and so they got a bunch of people together who sat down around the table and said, okay, what is it that we want kids to learn in grade 2 in the area of literacy? Well, grade 2, identify literary elements and author's purpose in imaginative and narrative and informative literature. That's a pretty tall task for a second grader, I think. How many of you would like to have to try to do that today? Demonstrate comprehension of information and reference materials in grade 2. Describe the influence of other languages on English in grade 2. Okay. Now here you are, you're going to do progress measurement. You're going to try to help build a system that teachers can use day by day, week by week, to attain these outcomes if they were to be in place in second grade. What are you going to pay attention to? Well, the beauty of academia, as you know, is we don't have to connect to the real world at all. We can just work in our little halls. And so I said, look, I can't chase around after everybody's ideas about what kids ought to learn in one grade, in the next grade, in the next grade, in the next grade, because if we get a new political regime in there, they'll change it again. And what am I going to do? Start all over again with a progress measurement system on the new regime's ideas about what ought to be in there? So from the beginning, we've tried to stick with what you might call core constructs in the area, like reading. That if you measured growth in reading, that it would generalize and allow you to predict how well a student might do in areas like this. That is, we expect that a student who's a good reader, whatever that might mean, is more likely to be successful on these tasks than a student who isn't a very good reader. So let's stick with reading, not with all of these sort of isolated elements that people might throw into a state standards assessment. And so we're, from the outset, looking for these vital signs of educational health, and we had to identify indicators of growth in curriculum areas. And we started out with reading, writing, and spelling as those 3 areas, and later added on math. I've always had that image, as I said, of monitoring growth across the developmental years. You know what that is, right? Height and weight chart. If you have a young child, you've already been in there fussing about it. Where does my child fit on the height and weight chart? Those are percentiles, bands that they have in there. And if your child falls low in any one of those or at the bottom, people worry about what should I be doing about that, and they go into family history and how tall are you? You're only 3'6" yourself. Why are you worried about it? You're doing fine. So we're looking to do something similar to that in reading. How do we do that? How do we identify those tasks? Oh, here they are. First of all, the first one we identified was reading aloud from basal texts. The second was writing words from dictation and spelling. Nothing very exciting about it. I mean, these are the things that you know about. Written expression, writing connected text in response to a story starter, and finally, solving fact and application problems in math. Now, how do we do that? How did we identify those particular tasks, and why have we stuck with them? This is only one of these that I'm going to be showing, and that's, we use this, what we refer to as a criterion validity framework to do it. Doug and Steve and Lynn and Jerry and Mark and get out in the literature and look for things that people, measures that people have used in empirical research on reading. Look at measures that people have used in empirical research on reading. So back in the 1978, 79, when we started this, Bert Chang, I forgot Bert's name. Bert is at Oshkosh now. Bert was from Taiwan and first Taiwanese student we had. Students went out and identified possible tasks that we might consider for use because they might meet those design requirements that we set up. They had been used by different people in different research studies in reading. And then we kind of created and modified some for ourselves. So the first one was just reading isolated words, if you will, list reading or isolated word recognition. The second one, reading words, single words in context. And so we had passages and we underlined every fifth word in a passage, and we have the child go along and point at the underlined word and just say the underlined word. So they didn't read the full text, but just the underlined word in case kids were using context somehow to help them do word recognition. The third one was oral reading of a passage. So we give the child a passage and the child would read aloud from the passage. The fourth one is the closed procedure where every fifth word is deleted. The child has to read along and guess at what the word is that's been deleted. This one, the word meaning procedure Phyllis Merkin created, was like the context task. Every fifth word was underlined, but then we would point to the word, the child would point to the word and the child would tell us what the word meant. And the judgment would be made by the scorer as to whether the student expressed the correct meaning of the word in that context. And then we also administered the Stanford Diagnostic Reading Test and the Woodcock Word Identification and Comprehension subtest. And went out and did studies, ran kids through all those tasks and created correlations between each of these things and those standardized tests. Now, why were we interested in standardized tests? I can remember I called, and you know who P. David Pearson is? He's a reading guru. Was at the University of Minnesota for a while, and now he's off someplace like Berkeley, or is that where he is? I don't know where he is at this time. But I used to play basketball with him at the University of Minnesota. I know I don't look like I could ever play basketball, but I did. I have really small hands, and I think I could have been great if I had larger hands. That's what I always tell people. The only thing that kept me back. I call, and David Pearson is a feisty guy, and he's still feisty as an academic, real competitor. And I called him up and I said, what's a good way to test comprehension, reading comprehension? I called about 5 different reading experts. They all said, you can't test reading comprehension. There isn't a good test of reading comprehension out there. No one would accept it. You're smiling, right, John?
Still true.
Nobody will buy into it, It's like. So I said, look, if you're going to publish a study in the long run, you're going to have data on a standardized achievement test at the end that shows that the experimental group did better than the control group. You're going to have to do that. We can't just provide these kinds of data and expect that people are going to believe that the formative evaluation system really produced improvement. They're going to say, but what about performance on an achievement test? So we were concerned about linking these two standardized test outcomes. I always thought that standardized tests I think they do scale proficiency. I do think they get at, in a reliable and valid way, kids' proficiencies. But they're too cumbersome for formative evaluation. So, as you can see, we generated some really high correlations between these potential repeated measurement tasks and the standardized tests. Since oral reading had a more face validity to it as a measure of reading. So if you gave a child a book to read, and the child sat there reading the words in the book, and you looked at somebody and said, do you think that child is reading? Most people would say, yeah, I guess the child's reading. Unless they were in the area of reading, then they would say, well, reading is constructing meaning from text, and we're not sure if the child is constructing meaning from text. So we have these passages, and these are some generic passages that Doug and I have created, that we give the student the same passage at the same level of difficulty. We have many equivalent passages then, and we have the student read these passages, and we score their reading performance on these passages in terms of number of words read correctly and incorrectly in 1 minute. Now there's an elegant datum for you, right? Have a child sit down and read 1 minute, count the number of words they read correctly and incorrectly in 1 minute. And that's supposed to be an indicator of general reading proficiency. So it does have a nice developmental growth pattern to it. So this is a study of about 675 students, some from Pennsylvania, some from Minnesota, and some from the state of Washington, all reading a third grade passage. They read it, there were first graders reading a third grade passage, and there were sixth graders reading a third grade passage. And you can see, which I guess it wouldn't surprise you to say that, well, look there, first graders don't read very many words correctly out of a third grade passage, and sixth graders read lots of words correctly out of it. So is that important? Well, it's important in the sense that if you think that you're trying to scale growth across time, you better get something that looks like this, right? So that sort of helped us to think, well, we must be scaling, there's this relationship between age and grade at least, and this reading indicator that we're seeking. Now, more recently, my colleague Chris Espin, who's on faculty with me at the University of Minnesota, now working on a federal grant, has been looking at the same measure for 8th graders. So and Doug is going to talk about this a little bit later, but the Star Tribune, local newspaper, and they pulled articles out of the Star Tribune, and they have 8th graders reading these articles from the Star Tribune. And what's interesting is these are individual data using HLM. So each of those is a growth curve or a progress line for an individual student, and of course the dark heavy line is the mean for the group. And as you can see at the onset, there's a spread or difference in the number of words read correctly out of the newspaper by 8th grade students. And it turns out, and I'll refer to it later, but Doug more, that these differences are directly related to differences on our state standards test. So the students who read more words correctly in 1 minute out of this newspaper article do better on the state standards test than the students who read less words correctly. What's interesting about this is there's no growth in 8th grade. There's just no growth. It's flat across there. And I've really been fascinated by that because I expected that especially the lower students here would actually, if there's some sort of a natural ceiling in oral reading for 8th graders, they get sort of to however in a natural reading of text, however high they're going to be reading, whatever rate they're going to be reading at, you'd think that maybe the lower rate students would actually grow across time to sort of catch up. But it doesn't happen. It's just phenomenal to me. And I'm really interested in it. It presents a problem for a formative evaluation system because even though in a criterion reference sense, these data are correlated with the state standards test, you can't use it very well in terms of sensitivity to growth to show that you're producing improvements because this is not a measure that's growing for these students in 8th grade. Now, so what we have done is work on, and I'll show you Chris's work on using the maze task, but back in 1986 or 7, I had a grant at the University of Minnesota, and we needed to go out and collect data on about 2,800 kids in Minnesota. And I thought, well, we can't go out, we don't have a budget to go out and do oral reading on 2,800 kids. Can't do it. You have to sit down with the child, have the child read for a minute, score it, and get another child. It takes a long time. And so without going into detail, we thought we've got to have a group administered procedure that will parallel the oral reading task as a way of measuring growth in reading. And so if you go back to that closed procedure that I had up there a while back when I was doing the criterion referenced study, criterion validity study, the closed procedure is deleting every fifth word. With the maze procedure, you delete every fifth word, but what you really do is put 3 alternative multiple choices in its place. So the student reads along and chooses one of the 3 words that's correct. At about the same time, we began to realize that while these measures like oral reading were really good in an area like special education where teachers had, at that time, a small caseload, it's not true anymore, but they did then, teachers could do this 1-minute sampling of oral reading on a regular basis. If you're going to expand it at all, it was very labor intensive, and you couldn't expect classroom teachers, well, you could, but it would be difficult to imagine for classroom teachers even weekly collecting oral reading data on every one of their students. And so at that time, the 3M company had given us the discourse system. Did they know that?
Some do.
Is it okay for me to say that? And of course, like a bunch of dumb academics, we gave it back. We never realized that it had any real money-making potential. And of course, we're not in it for money anyway. So, I've been teaching on the discourse system in the university classroom for a number of years, and Steve and Doug and I got a grant to apply the discourse system in elementary classrooms at that time to examine the possibility of using discourse to increase the success and inclusion of students with disabilities in regular class programs. That we could actually tailor and individualize programs better with the discourse system for students who were being integrated into the classroom. And one part of that began to be this idea that we could use this group response system that discourse was in the classroom as a way of integrating curriculum-based measurement with the discourse system, so that we could do these simple measures of reading and math on the discourse system. And the maze procedure was well suited for that because it allows the student to move along through text and make a response on the keyboard that could then be scored as correct or incorrect. And the potential then for eliminating all of that labor-intensive testing by the teacher on an individual basis and moving instead to a technology-based system where the student directly responded on the keyboard and those data could be scored and then aggregated became a real possibility. And we started working on developing that. This is just an example of what a maze passage looks like. It's pretty messy up here, but have you ever had nothing to do? Sometimes when I have nothing to, and then there's the deletion, and the child has to choose do, can, or so. I take a walk. That's when to, I, or do kick stones. I look for cans, to, bet, kit. Now the only thing really very interesting for me to point out about this is when we design these, and this is a key feature of this, we're interested in, because all of our research in this area indicated that productivity in fixed time was a really sensitive indicator of proficiency. Productivity, how many things somebody could do correctly in a fixed amount of time, was a really sensitive indicator of proficiency. In setting this up, it seemed to me that it was very important that the correct choice be transparent or very easy for the student in reading the text, so that if the student is reading along the text and understanding the text, you don't want the student to get hung up on trying to make fine discriminations about what the correct choice is among the three. Because what you really want to do is, when the student is reading silently, to get a measure of how much of the passage can the student traverse or get through. How many words can the student read through silently in 1 minute, using the maze as an indicator of whether or not the student is actually reading and understanding what they're reading. So that's what the maze choice is there. It's a check on the degree to which the student, when reading silently through the passage, is actually reading and understanding what they're reading. So very early on, when the students start to learn to read successfully, their accuracy starts to increase dramatically on this. As I said before, it turns out that the correlations between, I don't know, let's see, this is the correlation between the maze task and our state standards test in Minnesota. It turns out that this is for 8th graders now, reading out of the Star Tribune. This is Chris Espin's data. 8th graders reading out of the Star Tribune. Chris is interested in whether or not the length of time of the sample would have an effect on the correlations, and so that's why you see 1 minute, 2 minutes, and 3 minutes. We've always used 1 minute of oral reading. Just thought, well, maybe with the older students, the 8th graders, more time would actually increase the correlations. It doesn't really seem to do that. And so she was interested also in the maze. If you increase time on the maze task, would you get increases in correlations? But what you see in both instances is that there's a pretty high correlation between both oral reading and the maze and the state standards test. So the maze procedure, even at 8th grade, and in fact it looks like the maze procedure might be a better measure for 8th graders than oral reading. Because for the maze procedure, save for the fact that they apparently had some problems with passage difficulty over here, the maze procedure does have, this is actually statistically significant growth across time for these students. So these are the same students who were flat in their oral reading. On the other chart that I showed you, you can see that they're actually growing in their maze proficiency across time. So that's sort of interesting from an academic and conceptual point of view, I think. And it increases maybe the possibility of using the maze passage with the older students. We did discover in this research, and we didn't know this at the outset, that accuracy was not enough. As I said to you very early on, this is accuracy and performance, percent correct on the maze task, on maze passages. As you can see, even by 2nd grade, students these are fall, winter, spring repeats for 8th graders, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders doing the maze passage. We didn't give the maze passage to 1st graders. It's too hard for them in the fall of 1st grade. You can see the accuracy gets high on those passages very quickly. That is, by 2nd grade, 3rd grade, they're up 80–90% correct, which is what we really want. Remember, we don't want them to be inaccurate. We want them moving through the maze passages easily as possible. So percent correct on the maze passages is not a very good discriminator of reading proficiency. But if you look at number correct per minute of answering the maze choices, you can see that you get the same kind of developmental growth pattern. So the difference is that while students in 2nd grade might be equally accurate, some are reading many more words correctly or doing many more maze choices correctly in the same amount of time. And it's that productivity that seems to be, or fluency, that seems to be the key. I'm going to have to quit very soon, aren't I? So ultimately, we created this formative evaluation system. This looks like the first one I put up there. These are real data. This is individual student, teacher, teaching a student, measuring number of words read correctly, baseline, before going into special education, setting a goal, and connecting baseline performance with the goal out there. I don't know why it doesn't all show on there. Won't worry about that. The goal out there is about 120 words correct by the end of the year. The teacher is repeatedly measuring performance on the goal, on the student's progress toward that goal. And what we see is right at this point, that student's performance flattens out. And after 5 data points below the line, the teacher made a change in that student's instructional program. And the change seemed to produce an increase in the student's reading performance. These are the number of incorrects. The nice thing about this is not only can you see how the student is doing relative to that goal in his school curriculum, in contrast to where he was, but you can also see where the peers are performing in the same material. This was a 6th grade student who was referred to special education, reading about 1/3 as many words correctly in 1 minute as the other 6th graders in his classroom. So that I have that normative comparison as well. And that, as you will see in Doug's work, turns out to be an important way to screen and identify students who are at risk for failure. So earlier I said there are multiple references or multiple ways to interpret or multiple important features for interpretation of the curriculum-based data. It's individually referenced in the sense that you can see that the student is improving in his or her own performance across time. It's peer referenced or normatively referenced when you look at that student's performance on the same task in contrast to the students in this classroom. It's curriculum referenced when the stimulus materials are drawn from the curriculum, but I don't think of it as curriculum referenced or curriculum based if the stimulus materials are generic or generated outside of that curriculum. It's instructionally referenced in the sense that you can see whether or not the student's performance is changing relative to changes in the instructional program. And finally, and nowadays seemingly most importantly, these data, curriculum-based measurement data, are referenced to standards. They enable us to predict performance on high-stakes tests. School districts like the St. Croix River Education District, where Gary Gurman, I used Gary's name earlier, became the director of the St. Croix River Education District, and they have now for 25 years, as Minneapolis, been collecting CBM data. These are oral reading norms from the St. Croix River Education District. I won't go through them in any detail, except to point out one really fascinating thing. You can see this natural progression across grades in number of words read correctly in 1 minute from text. But notice again, in terms of fall, winter, and spring growth, I just happened on these the other day. In 8th grade, in SCRED, again, there's no growth in oral reading scores, and mean oral reading scores. Actually, they're slightly down in the spring. The students in Minnesota hibernate in the winter, and I think they were still slumbering when they took the spring data. Going full circle then, we were trying to provide educators with an efficient means to evaluate the effectiveness of their current instruction. And let me show you a couple of examples why this is important. Como Elementary School, I've worked with them for the last couple of years. Here's an example of one student who's about making the growth that the teacher desired. This is the teacher's actual chart from that school. But here's another student in that same classroom. You can see that student is falling below. Think of that height and weight chart, and this is your child whose height is now falling well below the 25th percentile, and you're starting to worry about him. That's a way to look at this, I think. These data are actually collected on the discourse system. These are maze data, and it shows you the same kind of thing. These are two different students in the same grade 3 classroom. This student starts out very low at the beginning of the year making maze choices, and this student starts out fairly high making maze choices compared to the class in general. But look what happens across the year. This is a teacher who's successfully homogenizing, I think, this class, so that by the end of the year, everyone will look alike. Now, you know, if this is your child, you might feel pretty good about this, but if this is your child, I don't think you would feel so hot about that. Their child is at the average. But you know, Minnesota's Lake Wobegon. Everybody's supposed to be above average in Lake Wobegon. The discourse system then has, I think, has potential for facilitating data collection using the maze procedure and allowing us to aggregate data within classrooms and across classrooms. And so here are classroom data. These are different classrooms now, in contrast to the mean performance of all these third grade classrooms. And you'll see again, this classroom starts out up here relative to the third grade mean and winds up here, which is actually the bottom class at the end of the year, whereas this class starts out as the bottom class at the beginning of the year and actually winds up right at the mean by the end of the year. Seems to me those data are important. Those teachers would be well advised to sit down and talk about what they're doing in those programs in their classrooms and how are they getting differences in growth like that. I don't think that you get those class data like that very well unless you use some kind of computer-based technology to accomplish that. These are just some examples in written expression, and I just wanted to show you this is 10th grade teachers. This is from Chris Espin's work. 10th grade teacher collecting written expression data, and she has an initial plan for how she's trying to teach written expression. She's monitoring those two charts that I just flipped through, and she decides that those students aren't doing well enough, so she makes a change, a 10-minute change within her warm-up activity for writing, and now continues to examine whether or not the students are growing as she had desired. And it turns out that in the study that they did, an experimental study this last year, the 10th grade teachers in written expression using the CBM approach were able to produce higher rates of performance or higher levels of performance in written expression. We've used two different approaches to set goals with curriculum-based measurement. You know, we set that line that goes out there, 120 words at the end of the year. How do you decide on what that ought to be? The two goals are using growth standards. We've actually analyzed data to look at what is the typical growth rate in these different CBMs across years. And we've also tried to establish benchmarks at the end of the year. These are the growth standards that we use in oral reading. Low, medium, and high growth rates at different grade levels so that people can use those as multipliers to set their goals. And these are some of the benchmark goals that we use. Instead of looking at growth rates and taking a child from where he was to where the multiplier would get him, we just say, okay, by the end of first grade, the student needs to be reading 60 words correctly, or by the end of second grade, 90 words correctly, or in order to be successful on state standards tests. Almost finally, we did this experimental study back in 81, 82, in the New York City schools. We had experimental and control teachers. Experimental teachers were using this curriculum-based measurement formative evaluation approach. Control teachers were not. Lynn Fuchs was then at Wheelock College in Boston. And since from where we are out there, Boston looked like it was close to New York on the map. We thought Lynn could run that study in New York City. I taught at the University of Delaware. I moved to the University of Delaware in my first teaching job, and I just got married, and my wife and I had never lived in New England before, so we were real excited about moving to New England. So it tells you something about the geography of people in the mid-United States. You know, there's that funny New Yorker magazine picture of, you know, New York, the Holland Tunnel, you know, the prairies and a few Indians and cactuses, and then San Francisco out on the west coast. Well, it's the same in the middle of the United States. I mean, everything looks like New England from the middle of the United States. Anyway, we ran this study. It was a pretty big study, experimental, true experiment. This was published in the AARJ. We contrasted students in terms, this was just in reading, and we contrasted students on the Stanford Achievement Test, the Comprehension Subtest, and the Structural Analysis Subtest. Experimental teachers, as you can see, the students of experimental teachers produce better achievement than control teachers in both comprehension and in this structural analysis. And not as surprising, of course, in terms of reading aloud from text, the experimental teachers produced a much better growth or performance and reading aloud from text as well. So, what's my conclusion? My objective conclusion, okay? These are objective conclusions. You know why I'm smiling? You know, I'm invested in this, so my conclusions aren't really very objective. But I do believe that CBM can be used to reliably and validly describe student growth and proficiency. Teachers can use CBM data to modify and increase their effectiveness, and CBM data can be used to assist in solving a wide range of educational problems. And here are some of those examples of those decisions that people are using, for which people are using curriculum-based data, or which are informed by curriculum-based measurement data. Doug will be sharing and talking a good bit about that with you. These measures have been used in elementary, middle, and some secondary classrooms. There's a fair amount of work now going on with English language learners. The St. Paul schools have been using CBM with English language learners, particularly Hmong Asian students and Hispanic students. One of my colleagues, Sue Rose, and I are doing a major project with deaf and hard of hearing students using curriculum-based measures, and we have this project going in the state of Arizona right now. And there's a certain amount of international work application of this curriculum-based measures. These are just norms from St. Paul in terms of math, written expression, reading, both oral reading and maze for Asian, Hmong students and Hispanic students used on CBMs. Currently, there are 2 just recently funded centers focusing on progress monitoring. We have one, it's a 5-year, roughly $5 million grant to do continued research on the development of a seamless progress monitoring system from kindergarten through grade 12 across reading, written expression, math, and science. And I think we'll probably get there about the same time as George Bush gets it to Mars. That's a tall order is what I'm trying to say. We got the money, we're going to be working on it, but that's a lot of work yet to be done. There was also funded another center, the funding agency, the grant, the people who got the grant is AIR, American Institute for Research. Doug and Lynn Fuchs are consultants to that one. This center is focused on helping school systems implement progress monitoring procedures. In the private sector, there's a lot of work going on. I had this idea that I was going to put ETS out of business when we started. Now it turns out that ETS becomes my best friend because there are people that will invite me out to talk. But there are products like AimsWeb that Gary Gurman has gotten started. CES, Children's Educational Service, has worked with a company called WebEdCo to produce Ed Checkup, and that's something that Doug and I are working on. Dibbles is working, Roland Good at the University of Oregon and Ed Kameanui, and they're working with Sopris West. Yearly Progress Pro McGraw-Hill is what Lynn Fuchs and Doug Fuchs have done with the work that they're doing. Wireless Generation, handheld stuff. I think they're working with Roland Good and Dibbles. So this system has produced a lot of private enterprise, private sector spin-off too now. That blank screen means that I got to the end. And I thank you. I'll be glad to answer a few questions, I guess. Is that right? Please.
I have a question
Yes.
concerning the 8th grade attrition and 6th grade as well. And wondering, since the ed psychology portion, is there any research also linking some of that to adolescent psychology and psychosocial behavior?
Actually, Steve Robinson's early work, if you'd be interested, as a graduate student, was on applying these same measurement concepts to development of social acceptance, trying to examine child's social acceptance and ways that you could measure that repeatedly in a classroom if you're going to try to collect those data. Doug has actually got a slide showing the relationship between a social skills behavior checklist and their curriculum-based measurement data in Minneapolis. But there's less work. There is something going on. One of our recent graduates, Ben Silvercliff is his name, had actually been doing his research in the area of social skills development, applying the same concepts to that. Yes?
Did you find any one specific instructional strategy increased outcomes more than
Well, you know, in the area of reading, of course, it depends on different areas. Actually, let's get into. I think that we need to develop a standard format for instruction that we can use to sort of baseline kids. I'm thinking of drug treatment studies where they have to, I don't know, they like dry people out or they put them on a certain regimen before they introduce a particular drug at different dose levels and so forth. They need to establish a consistent baseline. They need to know what they're operating off of when they introduce the drug. I think we need to do the same thing. And in the case of these measures, one big component of that intervention, I think, in that condition is going to be repeated practice on a task. But one of the things that teachers do that we have to scold them about all the time is if you're going to measure a kid by having them read aloud from text, they think that the best way to teach the child to read then is to have them read aloud from text. And just having them read aloud from text doesn't seem to work very well. It is the case, however, that this repeated readings procedure that seems fairly well known, widespread, and is one of the more powerful procedures for increasing oral reading fluency that I know about.